I'm pleased to host Dr. Carter Malkasian, who's a historian and the chair of the Defense Analysis Department at the Navy Postgraduate School. He is a former advisor to American military commanders in Afghanistan. He earned a doctorate in military history from the University of Oxford. After completing his studies, he became a teacher at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He then worked at the Center for Naval Analysis before spending time in Iraq conducting research in 2004 and 2006. In 2007, he worked with a provincial reconstruction team in Kunar Province in Afghanistan. He returned to Afghanistan in 2009 and spent 2 years in the Helmand Province as a State Department representative. From 2013 to 2014, he worked as a political advisor to General Dunford, the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. His major publications include War Comes to Gossamer, 30 Years of Conflict in the Afghan Frontier. The book is a history of the conflict in that district from 1979 to 2012. Illusion of Victory, The Anbar Awakening and the Rise of the Islamic State, published in 2017. It looks at Anbar's awakening and the Iraq troop surge in 2007 and attempts to explain why those events did not lead to a lasting peace in Iraq. And the book that's the focus of tonight's talk is The American War in Afghanistan, A History, which was published in 2021, which is, as best we can tell today, a comprehensive history of the war until unclassified sources come out, and then we get a completely different interpretation, maybe. I don't know. But thank you for doing this. We appreciate you came in. It is a complex war that quite often our public does not have a full understanding of, because the war in Iraq sometimes dominate the headlines. So I appreciate you coming in here and trying to make sense of the longest conflict that we've been involved in for some time.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to have the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. I know everyone's got busy schedules and a lot's going on. So it's great that you're able to be here and speak with me. I really appreciate the time and the generosity of Army Heritage Center. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Afghanistan, and sitting right now in California, rather far away from my time in Afghanistan, gives lots of time to reflect, and I guess a lot of times to get more accustomed to how the rest of the world has, or the rest of the United States has had Afghanistan in the distance. Because here in California, it certainly feels like it's in the distance. You can see the giant map on my wall behind me that was here when I arrived here. So certainly it fits kind of the view of the world of our leaders today, which is more about the world as a whole, which is probably good rather than Afghanistan. But let me talk about Afghanistan today. And let me talk about the issue that I think that most people have a lot of interest in, which is why we lost. And I'll try to go and keep myself to about a half hour so we can have some good questions and answers. I want to talk about why we lost through 3 different viewpoints. I want to go through the viewpoint of General Karl Eikenberry, who was one of our leaders there, an ambassador eventually. I want to go through the viewpoint of General Abdul Razik, who was an Afghan leader, a very controversial Afghan leader, an opponent of the Taliban. Then I want to talk about the viewpoint of Mowlvi Haibatullah. He's the current leader of the Taliban, or at least we think he is. He's not seen in the press much, and you always wonder if who you think is the current Taliban leader is actually alive or not. But what we do know about him, I'll try to share some of that to give us perspective of the question of why we lost. And to give you the answer to start, why we lost has something to do with the governance problems of the Afghan government. It has something to do with Pakistan. It has something to do with the fact that the government forces were less cohesive than those of the Taliban. And it has something to do with the spirit of resistance to occupation that can emerge when a foreign power, especially a foreign power who is not Muslim, enters another country. So with that, let me talk a little bit about these 3 figures. And I'm going to start with General Karl Eikenberry. General Eikenberry first came to Afghanistan in 2002, in the late summer of 2002. When he arrived, he was a brigadier general, a 1-star. He would be soon promoted to a 2-star, to major general. He was there to become the security cooperation officer, a job that didn't have a lot of definition when he arrived, but he turned himself into the person that was going to be designing, overseeing the advising, structuring the new Afghan security forces, including its army. Now, when he arrived in Afghanistan, we had won a smashing victory in 2001. The Taliban had been routed. The Afghan government of President Hamid Karzai was in place. Violence was low. Eikenberry was appointed largely by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who felt that he could be a good person to go and play a role in Afghanistan. Rumsfeld, throughout the year, had felt that Afghanistan was not a large threat to the United States. He had a large handle on how we would develop our policy. So that policy then involved a light footprint. It involved a great deal of counterterrorism operations. It involved working with warlords who had been able to run parts of Afghanistan following the fall of the Taliban, and to whom Karzai had delegated power. Rumsfeld originally didn't want to see an army built. He wanted that army just to be composed of the militias of the warlords and didn't want the United States to have to pay a lot of money. He was worried the United States could get stuck in a quagmire of nation building in Afghanistan. But over time, his opinion started to change as he realized that Afghanistan would really need an army. When Eikenberry came in, him and certain other Americans talked about the importance of having a national army, not an army built on what warlords wanted to create, but something that could actually both bring the nation together and to serve as a defense force. So it was going to be needed to impose stability throughout the country, to enforce stability throughout the country. Eikenberry's arguments eventually won Rumsfeld over, and Rumsfeld was willing then to support more U.S. funding and development of an army. And Eikenberry took that on. And one of the things that he did that shows a little bit of his mettle is he started removing some of the warlord influence from the army. And he insisted it be a national army, not an army divided by different ethnicities and different tribes. So he took the steps to make that happen. And he began the recruitment of the new army, which was supposed to be 70,000 troops, was the initial decision on how big that army would be. Over time, he was able to shape that army and get it going. And so by the time he left Afghanistan a year later, things were kind of well underway. However, we were never really willing to put in the kind of money and effort and the quality of advising necessary to create either an army that was highly professional or one that was large in numbers. And that was going to have problems for Eikenberry when he returned to Afghanistan. And he does return to Afghanistan. He returns to Afghanistan in 2005. Rumsfeld sends him back, this time as a 3-star lieutenant general, and his job will be to command all U.S. forces inside of Afghanistan. As the commander of all U.S. forces inside of Afghanistan, he now had a larger area to look over, and he went in feeling that the situation was going to be secure as it was previously. He had that confidence that had occurred still, the confidence still existed following what had occurred in 2001. That confidence was blinding the United States to the resurgence of the Taliban, as the Taliban were rebuilding their forces in Pakistan, starting attacks inside of Afghanistan. So Washington largely didn't believe the Taliban were going to come back, and many other senior military commanders didn't think so. Eikenberry quickly goes and visits units in the field, goes and sees the U.S. units places, talks to special forces units that are operating on the ground, and he starts hearing a different story. Starts hearing how things are going badly in some places, starts hearing about how there's more IED attacks and more assassinations, and how the Taliban is gaining influence in certain places. He hears about the massing in areas, and this makes him worried. And so as he becomes worried, he starts to communicate that back to Washington. Him and the ambassador Ronald Newman, they tell Rumsfeld that problems are emerging. Rumsfeld doesn't really want to hear it. They even tell President Bush. President Bush is more open to it, and he wants to do something about it. However, President Bush has to worry about what's happening in Iraq. As 2005 turns into 2006, that civil war in Baghdad is breaking out, and President Bush needs to worry about focusing attention on that rather than on Afghanistan. 2006 was a hard year, not just in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the Taliban launched a major offensive then. They've had time to reorganize their forces. They attack into Helmand. They attack into Kandahar, both in the south. They increase attacks in the east during that year. Because of that, it's a year of major violence, and it's a year when ground is lost to the Taliban. Eikenberry is trying to manage things wisely. He's trying to focus on where the Afghan people are and providing protection to them. He's trying not to get distracted into search and destroy missions or into large battles out into the mountains. He's trying to stay focused. He always values trying to build up governance, trying to let the Afghans take more of the fight themselves. Always values building up the Afghan army more. And so he continues to promote that. But for Eikenberry, it's also hard to control all of the different ways all the different commanders want to do things. So in spite of his advice, we find ourselves in a series of heavy battles in eastern Afghanistan in the mountains that suck up resources, make us suffer casualties, and also attract American attention towards really what's going wrong in the war. As his tour continues and 2006 turns into 2007, Eikenberry starts to think that maybe the war actually can't be solved by military force. Maybe the war isn't winnable. So he writes a note that goes up to the Secretary of Defense, which is now Robert Gates, and then goes up to President Bush. And that note says the war can't be won by military means. There's too many governance problems. It's too hard to get at the Taliban effectively. The right course is not to try to win by putting in more US forces or trying to win militarily. The right course is to try to build up the Afghan forces, turn over the war to them such that we can leave. So he has a little bit of a different strategic vision than had existed previously in the Bush administration. Bush administration, but President Bush reads the memo, is appreciative, but puts it aside, and continues on with the war. Eikenberry goes home, or goes home shortly thereafter. He was told a story by President Karzai during that time, as Eikenberry was trying to deal with the insurgency and fight the insurgency. President Karzai told him a story, and the story goes something like this. General, we do not have an insurgency here in Afghanistan. Because if we had an insurgency in Afghanistan, it would mean that people were fighting my government. And in an Islamic country, if you are fighting the government and the government is aligned with an infidel occupier, then you can rightly call for jihad. So you see, General, there cannot be an insurgency in Afghanistan. And what he meant by that was, of course, that there was an insurgency in Afghanistan, that there was a jihad, but they couldn't go and call it that and attack it directly. So this is part of the conundrum that Karzai had and the Afghan government had in trying to deal with this insurgency. Now, Karzai tried to address that by directing U.S. efforts towards Pakistan, towards treating Pakistan like the enemy, so that he wouldn't be fighting an internal insurgency, he'd be fighting an outside enemy. That, of course, though, never went very well, in at least his efforts to turn us against Pakistan. So Eikenberry goes home. He returns again in 2009. this time as the US ambassador. President Obama had appointed him ambassador. So he comes into this job with a different view than he had previously, a view that was more sober, more pessimistic. Upon coming to Afghanistan, he did one thing that he loved to do, which is go and talk to lots of Afghans, to see them in the provinces, to see them on the streets, and to make sure he was spending time hearing what the local Afghans had to say. But that only increased his concerns about what was happening in the government and how well the Afghan government might be able to govern the place. Now, this is also the time of the surge, when we decided to send in additional troops to Afghanistan such that our numbers got to about 100,000 in the country. This surge was a subject of great debate throughout 2009. General Petraeus, General McChrystal, who was the commander on the ground, felt that surging was important and the ideas of counterinsurgency could turn back the Taliban. Eikenberry was more skeptical. He felt that the government was not going to be a sufficiently capable partner to make this work. He was worried again about the ability even to militarily defeat the Taliban in the first place, and he preferred a strategy of turning things over to the Afghans. And so he argued against the surge throughout this period. Now, he lost that. He lost that argument. And he also suffered the unfortunate misfortune of having one of his cables leaked that criticized Karzai. Because of that, his relationship with Karzai during his last year or so as ambassador was not terribly good. But his strategic analysis was fairly good. The surge did not turn out as well as hoped. There were successes within it. There were tactical successes, but strategically it was extremely expensive. And because of that expense, President Obama decided to leave, to pull back the surge in 2011 and end the U.S. combat mission by the end of 2014. So Eikenberry retires from being ambassador, leaves in 2011, and he goes on to a career in academia, which he must take a certain amount of I don't know, perhaps pride that he had told the truth to the government, and he had seen some of the painful way that we would go. So that's General Eikenberry. Let me turn now to General Abdul Razik, a very different character. General Abdul Razik was a tribal leader, the Atsakzai tribe of southern Afghanistan. His tribe had fought the Soviets and then it fought the Taliban. It was fighting the Taliban largely because the Taliban it was fighting were largely from the Nurzai tribe, and his tribe was in competition with the Nurzai tribe for control of the Spin Boldak border post, where lots of commerce, both legal and illegal, passed, and taxation could be conducted with a great deal of fervor. In fighting the Taliban, his uncle and his father were killed by the Taliban, which didn't go over well with the young Razik. When the United States came in 2001 and went and pressed into Kandahar to remove the Taliban, he signed up with the advancing forces of Gulagashirdzai, drove into Afghanistan with them, and was part of the party that liberated. He was very, very young at the time. Now, as a tribal leader, he had to care a lot about making sure his tribe received money and received goods and services. So he worked hard to make sure that happened. He needed to make sure his fighting men were well taken care of. He also needed to be wary of other tribes, and maybe even wary of other members of his own tribe, to make sure they didn't knock him off, didn't take power from him, didn't push his tribe aside. During these years, he took control of border police around Spin Boldak. He worked closely with a series of American Special Forces commanders. U.S. commanders tend to be impressed with Razik for his bravery, his willingness to drive straight into battle, sometimes driving his pickup into the center of a fight, shooting while he went. He knew the border like the back of his hand. He could rally his men to fight, and his men had a very good esprit de corps. They were also taken by how he would care for his men. Sometimes, even later on, after his men had been in an operation, he'd land them up in a line and pay each of them a lot of money. Sometimes he'd give money to other forces that are working with him to show how much he cared about them. He grew in power over time through control of that border post, and his fights, though, with the Nurzai continued as well. He was particularly effective in dealing with the Pakistanis across the border, particularly aggressive against them, and felt that the Pakistanis were behind a lot of the problems that were occurring. His tribe spanned the border, so he had a unique amount of intelligence coming from over there. 2009, the surge is starting in the South, and the United States needs allies to work with. The original idea of the surge was not to work with warlords, to stay away from them. But Razik was highly effective, and General Carter, who's a Brit, and the commander in the South eventually conceded that in a war like this, you have to be willing to work with certain people. So the US continued to work with Razik, and he rose in power more. He eventually becomes police chief of all of Kandahar. In this role, he's able to help actually instill a decent amount of stability inside of Kandahar. That's because of how aggressive he is, how willing he is to get into the fight, and how well he rallies people together. Also, how when he takes money from the border post, he gives it back to people. He doesn't take it in pocket at all. He tries to spread it so as to suppress the insurgent activities inside of that province. In doing so, Raza continues to have enemies from the Nurzai tribe and from the Pakistanis. The Taliban overall considered him a scourge, and they target him repeatedly to be taken out. Americans have to be concerned about some of his ways. I don't have any firm evidence that he actually tortured people, had prisoner camps, or firm evidence actually that he shot prisoners. However, he said on press that he told his men to kill prisoners, and that he told them to kill Taliban, and kill them after they surrendered. He said that openly. So that's quite a double-edged sword. That's quite an enigma about what you do in this kind of situation working with someone like this. Is he helping the situation, or is he making the situation worse? Well, in the end, the United States never had to deal with what to do about Razik. Razik was killed in September 2018 by a suicide bomber. Actually, not a suicide bomber, an insider attacker. This was a young man who was from eastern Afghanistan, but grew up in Pakistan. He was told by the Taliban to go in and carry a weapon, to become part of the police. He actually wasn't part of the police, he was part of the governor's guards, become part of the governor's guards, and to shoot Razik. And eventually an opportunity availed himself to do that when our General Miller came to visit. And Razik came to the governor's compound, which he wouldn't have usually done. He was feeling a bit ill. And the insider pulled out his AK-47 and shot and killed Razik before the attacker himself died in a hail of bullets. When I met Razik, and Razik was incredibly charismatic, if you once stood aside, you wondered, why would Americans work with a person like this? When you met him, and he exhibited all kinds of signs of good leadership, and he talked to you about his vision and how he'd try to welcome you in as his guest, the charisma came out to a greater extent. But one of the things he told me in the many times I got to talk to him was, I asked him once, well, why are the Taliban so motivated? Or I asked him, who's got the better morale, Taliban or the government forces? And without hesitating or thinking, he said the Taliban. The Taliban do incredible things. They blow people up inside cities. We don't have people with that kind of commitment. So Razik. All right, let's move to the third person, Molly Haybatullah. In describing Razik, I tried to point a few things out. I tried to show how the government forces, how the tribes had divisions between them, and how the tribes weren't aligned together, and how the government couldn't align to have tribes in one. One thing I've also should have mentioned was the differences between the army and the police forces. They didn't always cooperate very well. In Kandahar, they sometimes could cooperate well because of the force of Razik. But otherwise, the army would tend to do its own thing, not want to support the police. And Razik was often very, very upset with the army that they wouldn't provide the kind of support that was needed. This is not to mention all of the internecine political squabbles going on inside of Kandahar city between various elites. Molly Haybatullah was not coming from a tribe. Molly Haybatullah came from a religious family. He had studied to be a mullah. A mullah is a religious leader in a village. And he wanted to be a mullah, and beyond that, a Maulwi. A Maulwi is a religious scholar. So a Maulwi has more intensive education in a madrasa, usually can read, speak Arabic, and is going to have to study the Quran very carefully. A Maulwi usually is expected not simply to preach in a mullah or to lead the prayer, but to go and to teach other people how to be mullahs and to provide religious teachings to people overall. Molly Haybatullah was too young to be a founding member of the Taliban or to be one of its founding leaders, but he was quickly a part of it. As a religious scholar, he was put in positions of being a judge, a qazi, to what was happening in various places in Afghanistan. Now, this is all in the 1990s. And Taliban governance involved use of religious law, the Sharia, Islamic law, the Sharia, and involved the judges playing a great deal of a role in law and order and in justice. Now, in Afghanistan, religious leaders will often play this role. However, it's usually diluted by government leaders doing the same thing. But in the Taliban's case, it was purely the religious judges doing things. So Molly Haybatullah was able to play that role. Played the role as a teacher. He was someone like most of the Taliban religious leaders who had a network of connections. Because a teacher has a certain relationship with the students. The students are expected to do things for the teacher. The students are expected to provide the money for the teacher and to do the orders, to undertake the orders of what the teacher is doing. I shouldn't say not provide all the money to the teacher, but to help the teacher in various ways. The teacher had other means through religious taxation of having money. So there's this more of a father-son relationship, or a father-son may be the best way to put it. There is more of a soldier-commander relationship between the student and the religious teacher than there is between a tribesman and a tribal leader, let alone between two tribal leaders. So that relationship helps establish a kind of a degree of command and control and a network between all of these different Taliban groups and these Taliban religious leaders. So even after the Taliban fall, Molly Haybatullah is still part of that network. And as a part of that network, he's able to talk to his former students. He's able to talk to other religious leaders. He's easily aware when the Taliban are deciding to reform, how he can be a part of that. That network also allows them to go not just within a singular province to have influence like Razik, but for that network to spread across multiple provinces. So the teachings of Molly Haybatullah may have been heard widely, let alone the teachings of Mullah Omar or some of the other very well-known Taliban leaders. When the Taliban come back to power in Afghanistan, throughout 2006 onward, Molly Haybatullah becomes the head judge of the Taliban. And he argues with Mullah Omar about suicide bombing. He argues that suicide bombing is acceptable. Suicide bombing is Islamic, because if we're fighting an occupier, it's righteous for people to be able to attack the occupier and kill themselves. Now, if this wasn't a jihad, if this wasn't happening, it wouldn't be righteous. But here in this case, it is. He argues in favor of that. That then becomes a very well-known Taliban technique that is very harmful for us, and I would argue very harmful for Afghan people. It's unclear today where that code stands. Mullah Haibatullah stays as head judge. As the war goes on, after 2012, the Taliban are staging a comeback following the surge. They're staging a comeback throughout southern Afghanistan and other parts of Afghanistan that grows over time. Mullah Haibatullah, living in Pakistan, survives when after Mullah Omar dies a natural death, and after his replacement, Akhtar Mohammed Mansour, dies at the hands of a U.S. drone. As head judge, Mullah Haibatullah is now in place to become the leader of the Taliban, which he steps into. In his early years as leader, we see the Taliban attack places like Lashkar Gah, attack places like, well, Kunduz was under Mansour, follow up with more attacks on Kunduz, slowly gain more and more ground as the Afghan forces have trouble holding together and start to fall apart. He remains a supporter of suicide bombing. A report comes out in 2017, that he sent his own son to be a suicide bomber, that his son blew himself up in Goresh, killing Afghan forces, and that Mullah Haibatullah had endorsed this action. Now, by my sources, it's unclear if that was really his son. It might have been an adopted son that did this, and maybe it never happened at all. But think about the meaning of this. A leader of a whole movement told the rest of the followers and all the Afghan people that he had sacrificed his son, killing him, and allowed his son to kill himself. That tells everyone else, you should let your sons go kill themselves. And it's almost horrifying in terms of what that, horrifying as a weapon to us, but horrifying in terms of what are you telling the Afghan people to become? What are you doing to their society as you ask for fathers not just to send their sons into combat, but to kill themselves in it? A tribal leader would not do that, would not have that, well, degree of commitment. Mullah Haibatullah allows negotiations with the United States to go forward as the United States tires of the war. He's never, as far as we can tell, in favor of concessions. He does allow, brief ceasefires to happen, but he presses a fairly hard line negotiating position that eventually sees the United States withdrawing. During those negotiations, the Taliban, I was part of those negotiations as General Dunford's representative. In those negotiations, we heard the Taliban make various promises. It'll be easy once you announce a timeline. We'll immediately have peace with the Afghans. It won't be a problem. Don't worry about it. Al-Qaeda is not in Afghanistan. They won't be in Afghanistan. They'll leave immediately. Do not worry about women. We will take care of women. We want to see improvements in governance. We believe what you believe. Well, you can see what happened to all those promises. Those didn't go very far at all. So if we step back and we look a little bit here, what do we see? We see the problems in governments that the Afghan government had in ruling in a way that didn't harm people. And as it did rule, it might have driven some people to join the Taliban. You can see Eikenberry's observations on that and Razik's whole experience in that. You can see the role of Pakistan in a place where the Taliban could hide and avoid being attacked. You can see how the government forces were not as cohesive as the Taliban were over time. Note how throughout this period and all the problems the Taliban faced, they were still able to come back and fight. Note how it's only really in the time of the removal of after the death of Mullah Omar, where there's a brief bout of violence, very brief bout of violence between the Taliban. Yet nevertheless, they managed a leadership transition, first to Mansour, and then another leadership transition to Haibatullah. Think about that in comparison to the tortured elections that the Afghan government had, where they weren't ever able really to come up with a cohesive, unified solution. But then think above all about what Razik said about the motivation of the Taliban and how Haibatullah was able to encourage people to do the worst of all things, suicide bombing. Think about that motivation compared to the motivation of the Afghan government forces, which I know closely, and I know many of them did fight. and many of them tried hard. But the overall picture from 2014 onward is one in which when U.S. airstrikes weren't present and U.S. advisors weren't present, the Afghan forces would get forced back, surrender posts, even when the adversaries had far fewer numbers than they did. So there's a motivation question here there. And I think that's got something to do with who felt they were fighting for a puppet and who felt they were fighting for a very driven movement. So I'll stop there, having gone 30 minutes, which is about as long as anyone should talk on Zoom or Teams.
We'll open it up for questions now. We have one here from, let me get the question and answers up. This comes from Peter. Did the U.S. have a strategy after its initial success in 2001, or just try to figure out what to do next?
Great question. The United States absolutely had a strategy. We may not like the strategy. We may think it wasn't properly constructed. We may think the means and the ends don't match well. But there was a strategic goal after 2001. That was to complete the defeat of Al-Qaeda, prevent the Taliban from coming back. That strategy is clearly stated in OSD and NSC documents, and it was clearly stated by Rumsfeld and the president repeatedly, and it was clearly known by troops on the ground that that's what they were going after to do, sometimes with too much focus. Another part of the strategy that was a little bit more implicit, but that comes out in strategy documents over the time, is to enable an Afghan government to stand up and stay in place. And that turns into enable an Afghan democracy to stand up and stay in place. Those two goals are quite clear from the beginning. The ways and means to attain them are less clear. So should we have, it's a small number of troops and we have a lot of stuff dedicated to counterterrorism. How long troops should stay, what the milestones are, what the conditions are for leaving, those are not well stated. A lot of energy isn't put in place in towards actually achieving these goals. Hence why Rumsfeld will complain from time to time in his memos, where's the plan? Why isn't there a plan yet? So there wasn't a good plan, but there were goals that were in place. So there's a strategy that's there. We may just say it wasn't a very complete strategy.
This question comes from JP. The decision to create a national army was clearly consequential. Did Eikenberry push that because he viewed it purely as a security imperative, or were there some hopes that it would have a beneficial political effect? And he's thinking specifically of whether he was hoping for something akin to the role of the Continental Army during the American Revolution as being a national, creating a national identity.
So all of those. So Eikenberry did think this is necessary for security, that you needed to have security occurring in the country. Now that at this time frame, there's less of a concern about Taliban creating insecurity than different warlords doing different things and that creating insecurity. But still a security problem. A view to have the best kind of security, you need a professional, well-trained military. He wanted a quality force. He believed you only needed 70,000 because he thought that's about what the Afghan government could afford later if we reduce the amount of support and funding that we were providing. So those are, some fairly sound ideas. Did he also hope that it would have the political effect of helping to unify? Yes, and he has a fascinating quote on it, where he says, we needed to, the army was important towards unifying the country, and it had to have a nationalism there. He said something to the effect of that, well, we would be foolish to think, though, that us outsiders could actually impose unity or identity or nationalism upon them. That had to come from the people. It also can't come from the army. The army cannot create nationalism within a country. It can help unify, but it can't create that spirit. It has to come up. Now, you can see there's some tensions in what he's saying here, and he kind of came to an understanding of what the problem was here. Believe strongly you still needed to create the army to help in this, but it's almost like he could see that there's there's a fundamental issue here with how much the Afghans are going to stand up and support it. Now, he also thought that if you create a tribal army, that's not going to be effective. If you create a set of tribal armies, that's not going to be effective. You shouldn't just have a Pashtun army or a Tajik army. And some people thought that's what you should do. Just create a Tajik army, an Uzbek army. They want to fight. They want to do things. Well, that opinion was also a little bit wrong. The Tajiks didn't like to fight in the south or the east where the Taliban were heavy. They preferred to stay in the north or stay in Kabul. They didn't want to go to those areas. Now, they did in the end, they did a lot of fighting there, but on their own, they weren't that interested in it. So having an army that was composed of everyone, I can see how he got to that point. And I've talked to a lot of people who think that when you should have local forces in local areas like militiamen, and have them deal with the problem, and everything should be extremely light. So like where I've worked in Afghanistan, I'm very like partial to the idea of, well, let's build up a lot of local forces, let's get them recruited, let's have them be light. And so I see a lot of virtues in that. The problem is that we did create forces like that. They were called the Afghan local police. They could do well in the right circumstances, but in the end, they cracked like everyone else did. So there isn't much evidence to suggest if you had lots of tribal militia that they would have been able to do any better against the Taliban than what the Afghan army did.
I question, when you look at the National Army, were the units still at the lower levels still tribal?
No.
Or did they mix the various tribes even at the lowest unit levels?
They tried to mix them throughout. Now there weren't enough Southern Pashtun soldiers, so in many areas you'd have units that were largely Tajik, Uzbek, or maybe Eastern Pashtun, and you wouldn't have enough representation in certain areas. And certain units would, for whatever reason, have like a whole lot of Tajiks or maybe a whole lot of Hazaras. So it didn't work always perfectly, but you don't have an army battalion that's locally recruited from one area, say like that they're all from Jalalabad. Now, what you do have is you have police forces, and the police forces generally outnumber the army through the war. They're not as trained well. They're slightly more prone to corruption. They have more tribal kind of issues within them, because there's no province has one tribe in it. Practically few districts, when there's about 15 districts for province, districts like a county, few districts have one tribe. Most have multiple tribes in them. So the police would reflect that composition. So they'd also have multiple different tribes within them. But the police would have a somewhat better ability to go and get intelligence. And the police were, if they had a good leader like Razik, they could be somewhat effective. I really want to be careful in stating effective, because it's not in the kind of sense that we think of as effectiveness. And even the forces that you might call tribally effective had a lot of problems in. Now, the third group is what I call the Afghan local police. And those are basically tribal militia that are established. They're supposed to be established in fairly small groups of 100 to 300 in specific districts. Some of those units would be purely of one tribe. Some also would have multiple tribes in them, but they tended to be much, much more local.
This question comes from John. He says, I agree we lost the war in Afghanistan, but don't agree with you what you seem to say in your book, that the war was unwinnable. We had successes in certain places at certain times. Why couldn't we replicate that elsewhere? How could we have won the war? He was thinking about negotiating with the Taliban was critical. We couldn't do that in 2002 or 2003, maybe later. I mean, so he's looking at, could we have negotiated earlier?
So there are, I guess I'd caveat what I say, the war wasn't entirely unwinnable. There were times when there were opportunities for it to go a different direction, but those opportunities were very few, which if I was to generalize my statements, yes, I would say that means unwinnable. However, in the early parts of the war, there's more latitude to make a difference. There's more latitude for the United States to undertake negotiations, and the Taliban are weaker, so those negotiations may have gone better if we have done that. There's some kind of famous examples of this and how we turned down opportunities when the Taliban were reaching out to us. Also, there's opportunity at that time in the construction of the army. And then there's some very big opportunities, but very hard to do counterfactuals on, very big opportunities to go ahead and create a different kind of government, one that was less centralized, less dependent on Karzai, and certain people felt that if a government that was less centralized would be more accountable to the people. So there's some big kind of the big choices that may have created some opportunities. But overall, the opportunities were limited. And especially after 2006, when the Taliban started to gain momentum, They don't want to have negotiations so much anymore. It's harder for us to build an army because we're in conflict, so it's harder to make it happen more. More of our troops are demanded to be in country, and if more of our troops are demanded to be in country, that raises the amount of resistance that we get. So all these problems start to emerge. Now, the places that I do know of success occurring, the problem for me is that when we withdrew our forces, those places that were successful fell apart. After 2015, I know of very few occasions when the Afghan forces on their own stood and defended against the Taliban attack without US air support, without US advisors. Could we have stayed longer in Afghanistan, leaving some advisors and aircraft to just keep the Taliban back? Yes, we could have done that. That would have been a strategy. I think it's a viable strategy. I'm not sure I'd call it winning, but you could see a circumstance where we have just enough soldiers, we have the right tactics, techniques, and procedures that we can't defeat the Taliban, but we can hold them back basically indefinitely. Now, we didn't choose to do that. Withdrawing was also a viable strategy. But I wouldn't call that winning. I would call that more like we're holding and managing the problem. I can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're on mute or if I lost you.
I was on mute for a second. If Huckleberry was so pessimistic about the conflict, why didn't that come out more when he testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee specifically?
So I've read some of that testimony, and I was in meetings with him in 2006 and 2007 where that degree of pessimism didn't come out that way. And I think many of you in the audience will know as well as I do the difficulties of talking in front of public. And so I guess I largely credit him for telling the president what he thought. I don't know what he said in private to the Senate. Could he have said more to the Senate without breaching confidences? He probably could have said a little bit more there. But I also think that the American public was very well aware of how bad things were going in Afghanistan, because other people were talking about that. And President Obama was certainly very well aware of that. Mullen said openly that we're not winning. I think there was a lot of information available that things weren't going well.
This is sort of a mix of two questions from Charlie and from Dave. One, what should we have done? And what do you see the future of Afghanistan?
So some things we should have done. We probably should have tried to negotiate earlier. Probably should have spent more on their army earlier to give us to reduce the amount of burden that was on us, even if it wasn't going to result to peace. We should have later on at the time of the surge, and this wasn't as apparent to me then as it is now. When this time for the surge came, we probably shouldn't have surged. We probably should have held troops about what they were or increased them just slightly. Instead of talking about that we're going to surge and turn things around, and we should have said is we're not going to surge, we're going to keep our troop levels here and we're going to stick it out. Because that's essentially what we ended up doing. That's what we did till 2021. And after 2014, we had fewer troops in Afghanistan than we had before the surge. Yet we managed to hold more ground than we had before the surge. So we ended up doing the surge. We suffered about half our casualties in that time. If we hadn't have done it, we wouldn't have taken as much ground. But in the end, that didn't matter anyways. And we know we probably could have held what we had then with fewer troops. Now there's a lot of retrospect involved in that assessment. But I think with like some more honest discussion and more debate, we might have been able to come to that kind of decision. Those are three things I'd say that would have helped to do something different. There's a lot of little things that we could have done throughout. We earlier could have better put conditionality on the money we were giving to the Afghan forces. We could have, and to all of Afghanistan. We could have not put money directly through the Afghan government where it was getting lost. We could deliver it more directly ourselves. These are small things, though. These aren't things that are going to create a strategic change. Where is Afghanistan going right now? In a way, it's too early to tell because we're still too close to the Taliban having fallen. We haven't seen the kind of cracks that were often predicted in the Taliban. We've seen them able to manage things. We haven't seen them get much outside assistance. That's expected as far as I'm concerned as well. The United States has left Afghanistan because we thought it wasn't important. We're not going to help the Taliban regime for something we didn't think was important. How they're treating women is not surprising, not as bad as it might be, but they've been gradually making things worse for women in Afghanistan. How long will the Taliban regime last? Hard to say. Right now, I think we would be unwise to predict an immediate collapse, but governments in Afghanistan don't tend to last a tremendously long amount of time. So we'd probably be unwise to predict that they'll be around longer than 10 years, and we should readjust our prediction every year to think what that's going to be.
Yeah, can they overcome tribalism?
Well, that's the advantage that the Taliban had in war, is that they were able to overcome that because their codes weren't based so much on tribalism. They had tribes aligned with them and working with them, but because their codes were based on more about religion, they were able to, and because they were able to use religion to say how people should hold together, and because they were able to speak with authenticity when they were doing it. A tribal leader can talk about we should be united because of religion, but the other tribal leaders aren't going to listen. A religious leader can do that. So now the Taliban can continue to do the same thing. And I'd say overall they've been fairly cohesive, never mind the disputes and issues between the Haqqanis and Haybatullah side in Kandahar. But the amount of divisions haven't been what some might have predicted. What we don't know, though, like you said, is if they'll be able to maintain it. Maintaining cohesion under war is different from maintaining cohesion in peacetime. And as time goes on, those Taliban leaders who saw how important cohesion was in war, and maybe how important it was in the 1990s, and saw in the 1990s how when you don't have cohesion, you have civil war and it's awful, those leaders are going to get older. And their influence will recede, and new leaders will emerge who won't have that experience. So that could break down the cohesion over time.
This comes from Joe. It's more of an economic question. Without a viable economy, except based on drugs, and a very small middle class, can you ever hope for a truly peaceful Afghanistan?
So anthropologist David Edwards would say, not a peaceful Afghanistan the way we think of a peaceful Afghanistan, but you could have an Afghanistan that has an acceptable degree of instability or a stable degree of instability, where yes, there's tribal conflicts from time to time. It's not safe to be, driving alone in Afghanistan, but while these periods of and that governments will be overthrown from time to time, but within that, life is livable, because you still don't have the degree of war you had under the Soviets. You don't have suicide bombing going on, and there may be poverty, but people can still live a life there. And so David Edwards would say that may be an acceptable solution for Afghanistan, a kind of stability. And what we don't know is that old idea of instability, of stable instability, can that ever return? I mean, the wars of 1979 onward, they did a lot to Afghanistan. You see a lot of dramatic changes. A monarchy disappears. Communism is attempted and fails. Mujahideen movements and warlords don't bring things together. Democracy fails. What's the one thing that lasts throughout this? The Islamic rule of the Taliban lasts throughout it. So maybe we have seen a change. And I don't know if that change means that there's going to be more violence the way it was before, or if it means that no, the Taliban are going to create some kind of stability for a longer period of time, and maybe they'll be followed by someone else who provides stability, or maybe not. A lot of uncertainty there.
Question is, did we think that we could ever negotiate with the Taliban and have them live to their agreements? Or were they more like our negotiations, say, with some of the communist governments, both in Vietnam and and in Korea, that they will
So
say anything to get Americans to leave, and then they implement their own plan?
there were many Americans who felt that the Taliban would live up to what they were saying, or that another way to put it would be that the deal would work. So you had some people involved in negotiations who felt the deal would work. The Taliban sincerely believed the things that they were saying. Other Americans pointed out the problems that were going to exist here, that there aren't really good conditions being put down, that the Taliban will have every reason to renege on what they're saying, and you should never, ever give a unilateral concession, and don't tell them a timeline. And so those are some very pragmatic pragmatic guides for negotiations, and I suggest you take them with you next time you go to the car dealer. When you're in negotiations, one thing that I found was hard was being the naysayer, but thinking I'm naysaying, but what if this is going to prevent peace? And wanting to give another try. Mullah Baradar was very convincing when he would talk about how he wanted to see Afghans come together and how he wanted to compromise. And part of that because he felt like a tribal leader from the villages, and he had the look of them, and he talked like them, and he looked at you like a tribal leader would look at you. And you don't really want to stand in the way of a chance for peace. So like one of the questions in when the Taliban were saying a lot of these things in like the summer of 2019 was, well, maybe the Taliban mean it. Maybe they'll do these things because they know if they don't, we won't leave, and we'll hold to our conditions, and we won't get out of Afghanistan entirely. We'll stick it out. But then on the other hand, you think, well, maybe they know that once we leave, well, let me put it a different way. Maybe we'll see with our conditions that we'll stick it out, but maybe we won't hold to a condition. And if we won't hold to a condition, they won't hold to anything, and their incentives will change. When they say we don't hold, then they'll start using violence again. And that's one explanation for what happened, that maybe they were sincere initially, but once they had the opportunity, they took it. Doesn't mean they weren't sincere earlier, just means they were exploitative. Now, another answer would be they're lying to us the whole time. And there's some evidence for that.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in tonight. We did have a small audience. What I would ask that audience to do is I will bunch this out to one of the people who signed up, and the people who came. Please pass this to your friends and associates. This is a great, Carter, thanks for doing this. It did make a bit more sense. Even though we have some folks who were very much involved with some of the leaders here that participated, especially John. But thank you for giving your observations, and if we can do anything here at the AHEC for you, let us know, and we'll facilitate some research for you.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate seeing everyone down there. And hey, 14 participants from my perspective, that's fantastic.
So, well, I was hoping all 60 would show up, but you know,
beautiful day is a beautiful day.
Little League baseball sometimes takes control. I don't know what it's like out in California, but it's pleasant here today.
It's nice.
So again, thank you much, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you. Take it easy. Everyone have a great night.
Bye-bye.